The day they brought me here, they told me it was for my own benefit, but all I heard was goodbye. I'm Beulah Ellis, 74. In the morning, they mentioned how the town wore autumn like a cozy shawl. Gold light slid over the storefronts, gliding across the hood of Daniel's SUV. Maple leaves danced lazily in the air before settling on the windshield, as if the season itself were trying to stall for me. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp apples, the kind of fragrance that makes your hands recall harvests. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the road, repeating that it was safer this way. He's always been the practical one. Crisp shirts, firm plans. He's the type of man who believes a checklist can steady the heart. His voice was soft, the kind you use with a jittery horse. Laura sat in the back, tapping through emails, lips tight, preparing for a meeting she'd join once she found Wi-Fi. She mentioned the center had excellent reviews and that I'd make friends. She also mentioned my house had stairs, and that stairs were statistics. Mark sat beside me in silence. He's the middle child, caught between storms. When our eyes met in the rearview mirror, he quickly looked away and said, "Let's focus on the positives." Maple Grove finally appeared at the end of a long drive lined with fiery maples. The brick of the building glowed like a cooling ember. A fountain whispered in the courtyard, the water holding a scattering of leaves like tiny boats drifting aimlessly. Inside, the floor was spotless, and the shine smelled faintly of lemons. A television hummed the morning news at a low, comforting volume. A cart rolled by, offering oatmeal and cinnamon, and I felt hunger and grief quietly jostling inside me. Daniel informed the receptionist that we had an appointment. He added that he'd taken care of the paperwork, because I tend to get overwhelmed. Laura checked her watch and said we needed to be quick. I nodded as if I agreed. In my mind, another scene played out. A kitchen from 30 years ago, when my hands moved faster, and the table was full of noise. The roast clicked in the oven. The radio softly played Motown, and the boys used their forks as drumsticks until their father cleared his throat with mock thunder. We said grace without checking the time. Laura bragged about a spelling bee ribbon, and Mark tried to trade green beans for rolls. Daniel meticulously counted the slices to ensure no one got shorted, even down to the last crumb. That dining room was small, and everything fit. Laughter, tired feet, stories about scraped knees, and promises tossed across the table like little boats always making it to shore. I can still feel the heat of the oven when I opened it, and the joy of announcing that the pie was set. In the admission office, the clock ticked louder than any church bell. The director smiled, explaining activities therapy and a calendar full of cheerful events. I heard her words, but also the soft sound of something closing. Daniel said, "Mom loses track of time and repeats herself." He said it gently, like a headline he wished weren't true. He looked at me as if the right glance could make him less right. Laura handed me forms and said it would help if I signed today. She said we were being proactive. She promised to stop by after work, maybe later this week. Mark touched my elbow and said this was temporary, just until we sorted things out. He said my safety was the most important thing. He sounded like he was reading from a card written by someone else. I asked if anyone had asked me what I wanted. The director folded her hands and replied, "Everyone wants the same thing, to feel secure." Daniel said I'd thank them one day. We walked down the hallway to my room. The door was ajar, like a mouse about to speak. From one room came the soft click of knitting needles, from another, a cough that sounded like a branch snapping. My room was neat and ready, bed made, curtains open to a slice of blue sky. A vase held 3 sunflowers, their faces turned toward the window. A new quilt lay folded, like a promise that hadn't yet learned how heavy promises can be. Daniel placed my suitcase on the chair, and reminded me where the call button was. He said the move would be easier if I didn't try to pack more things. He added that the house needed to be cleared by the end of the month. Laura put a framed family photo on the dresser, adjusting it twice. She said I'd be close to town, making visits easier. She mentioned the staff was trained. One of those things you say when you don't want to think about tenderness. Mark draped my sweater over the chair and stared at the quilt's pattern. He said he'd take care of the garden, and my peonies wouldn't miss a season. He promised to call tonight. I tried on my new life the way you try on shoes at a store, walking in a slow circle to see where they rub. I run my fingers along the wall. I hear the faint sound of cartwheels and the gentler sighs that linger in spaces where days overlap. They embraced me, like people who are running late. Daniel's arms were short but firm. Laura's hands held a phone, and the lingering promise left its mark before fading. I watched them disappear down the hallway. 3 silhouettes that once pulled at my skirt now tugged at their calendars. I settled onto the bed, counting my breaths until the door clicked. I remembered the smell of Sunday gravy, the sound of fork tines scraping heavy plates, and a vinyl record that always skipped at the same lyric. I thought about how boys become men while you're washing dishes. A nurse helped me find the dining room for lunch. She had warm eyes and the quiet grace of someone who continues to show up. She told me the soup was chicken, and that the rolls were served warm. I smiled, thanked her, and kept the rest to myself. Some things you hold close because they're the only constant warmth you have left. Some things you don't speak of until the room is ready to hear them. When they brought me here, I heard goodbye and the click of another door opening somewhere far away. Last week, a lawyer called with news from California. My sister had kept a secret, and now it's mine. If I decide to act on it, everything about this place, and my place within it, will change. A week after I arrived at Maple Grove, the phone in my room rang with a voice from another life. The lawyer's tone was calm, but the words spilled out like light through a crack. My sister in California had passed away, and left me $6.8 million. I remained perfectly still, tracing the armrest with my thumb, letting the number settle inside me like a seed looking for soil. That afternoon, I requested the public records terminal in the library. The computer was slow, but steady. I searched property filings and corporate records for Maple Grove and its parent company. I jotted down names, addresses, and filing dates in a small spiral notebook, tucked under a stack of crossword puzzles. I discovered that the chain owned 3 facilities in Oregon, each under the same holding company, all burdened by loans that made them vulnerable. That night, I called the lawyer again and asked what it would take to quietly buy them. We talked about trust shell entities and how to keep my name out of the news until the time was right. His responses were clear, and I could almost hear him leaning in when he realized I wasn't just a curious old woman, but a client with a plan. The days passed in their slow rhythm. Mrs. Powell, once a literature teacher, sat by the window with a stack of old essays she'd saved. She'd read a paragraph aloud, then stare at the air as if waiting for the chalkboard to reappear. Across the hall, Mr. Harland, a retired Navy sailor, shared sea stories that smelled of salt and diesel. His hands shaped the air into waves, masses, and storms that never touched land. I listened more than I spoke. I kept track of the worn carpets, the flickering fluorescent lights, the chairs in the common room that seemed ready to sigh with tired stuffing. I noticed which aides worked past their shifts, and which ones disappeared the moment their hour ended. I counted how many residents had family visit more than once a month. The number was small. One Sunday, I stood at the edge of the courtyard and watched a family gather under a maple tree. A young boy chased leaves while his grandmother held his jacket like a tether. The parents poured coffee from a thermos and shared muffins still warm. Their laughter floated across the grass, and something in me connected that sound to the silence in my own room. That was the moment when the plan took shape. Within a month, the trust had signed purchase agreements for Maple Grove and the 2 sister facilities. The next morning, I walked the halls, knowing the floor beneath my feet was mine in a way no one here suspected. The first order I signed was for new lighting, carpets, and chairs designed to last. The second was for fresh paint in colors that felt like dawn instead of dusk. The kitchen received upgraded equipment, along with a budget for fresh produce from local farms. The activity room got a piano tune for the first time in years. In the garden, I had benches installed beneath the trees and created raised beds for vegetables. Then I drafted the new policy. Every resident would have the right to see their family at least once a week. Families unable to commit to this would have their visiting hours restricted to weekends. A rule designed not to punish, but to protect the time that mattered most. I signed it with a pen that felt heavier than its weight. I kept my name off the memos and stayed out of the staff meetings. The changes unfolded quietly, like rising tides, elevating the place without anyone noticing the force behind them. I walked the halls at night, hearing softer laughter, smelling better coffee, sensing the hum of a space coming to life. In the mirror, I appeared unchanged, but underneath my skin, a steadiness had settled, one I hadn't felt since the house was mine, and the children were young. I wasn't just a resident anymore. I was the guardian of this space, and I still had work to do. The first call came from Daniel. The receptionist at Maple Grove later told me that his voice was low but sharp, each word clipped as if he were reading accusations in court. He demanded to know who decided how often he could see his own mother. The next morning, an email from Laura arrived in the administration inbox. 3 paragraphs of corporate outrage, accusing the facility of abusing its power. Mark never called or wrote, but when I saw him in the hallway, his jaw was clenched tight enough to hurt. 3 days later, the administrator summoned me to her office, saying the children had requested a formal meeting. The conference room was bright with tall windows and a polished table surrounded by leather chairs. A framed chart of Maple Grove's mission hung on one wall, a strategy map on the other. A pot of coffee steamed in the corner, its scent heavy in the still air. Daniel was the first to arrive, in a suit with his tie knotted the same way it had been since his college interviews. He placed his briefcase down like he was about to open it as evidence. Laura followed, wearing a blazer and holding a phone, her thumbs busy until she looked up and saw me. Mark slipped in last, hands in pockets, eyes scanning the room without focusing on anything. The administrator began explaining the new visiting policy, her voice measured, her gaze moving from one face to the next. Daniel interrupted, claiming this was a violation of family rights. Laura followed, her tone sharper, demanding to know who gave anyone the authority to decide when she could see her mother. Mark remained silent, but his foot tapped under the table. I let them speak. Then I entered the room. The atmosphere shifted. The administrator stepped aside. Daniel's words stopped mid-sentence. Laura lowered her phone to her lap. Mark's eyes finally settled on me. I walked to the head of the table and set down a folder. I told them I was the chairwoman of Maple Grove, and that the decision they were debating was mine. Silence hung for a moment too long. The kind that shows how deep surprise can run. Daniel's brow furrowed, as if he was trying to calculate the gap between what he thought he knew and what I had just said. Laura's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a search for what she had missed. Mark's shoulders relaxed just a fraction. I explained that the rules weren't meant to punish, but to protect the time we had left. This place belonged to me now, and the people in it deserved the kind of care that went beyond routine visits on holidays. Daniel leaned back, his jaw working silently. Laura blinked slowly. Mark took his hands out of his pockets and rested them on the table. When no one spoke, I closed the folder, stood, and walked toward the door. In the hallway, residents were gathered in small clusters, some waiting with eyes bright with something unspoken. As I passed, a soft ripple of applause began, growing louder until it filled the corridor. I kept walking, the sound following me like a tide. At first, the visits happened like clockwork because they had to. Daniel showed up every Sunday with a pie from the bakery. I liked placing it on the table as if to prove he had been there. Laura started adjusting her travel schedule so she could visit twice a week, sitting by the window with coffee, her voice softening as time passed. Mark came every Tuesday evening, quiet but steady, never missing a week. As the weeks turned into months, the edges of obligation faded. Daniel stayed long enough to help serve supper in the dining hall. Laura began bringing flowers for the lounge, and stayed to help with trivia night. Mark started lingering after dark, sometimes walking me to the garden just to hear the crickets. They no longer checked the clock. Conversations drifted. Laughter filled the corners of the room. One Tuesday, after the others had left, Mark asked if we could sit in the lounge by the fish tank. The glow bathed his face in soft gold as he told me he had stayed quiet during the conflict because his marriage was falling apart. He was afraid that if he fought too hard for me, he would lose the last thing he thought he had left. He said he couldn't bear the thought of losing everything the way he believed I had. His words hung between us, like a truth that came too late, but was still worth knowing. I had thought their absence was due to carelessness. Now, I saw how fear can paralyze just as much as indifference. That understanding didn't erase the hurt, but it shifted something inside me. Late that summer, the 4 of us found ourselves in the garden together. The air was warm, tinged with the scent of rosemary. Daniel poured lemonade into glasses while Laura arranged slices of peach pie. Mark sat next to me on the bench, his shoulder brushing mine. We laughed at an old story, and the sound felt complete. The sun dipped low, casting amber light on their faces. I thought about how the past can't be undone. It sits where it is, unchanged. But what we do with what remains is ours to choose. And I choose love for the time we have left.